On December 8, 1980, the world lost a legend. John Lennon, a cultural icon and former member of the Beatles, was brutally shot dead in front of his New York apartment. But the story doesn't end there. The FBI was thrust into a high-stakes investigation that would lead them into the depths of a deranged killer's mind and the complexities of a case that gripped the world. This wasn't just the death of a famous musician. It was an act that sent shockwaves through the world of entertainment, politics, and global security. But how did the FBI get involved in one of the most high-profile criminal cases of the 20th century? Imagine working on a case that captures the attention of millions of people worldwide. As an FBI agent, I've worked on cases that had international repercussions, but nothing like the death of John Lennon. We had to navigate through a tangled web of evidence, psychological profiles, and a media frenzy. How did we crack the case? And what did we learn about the mind of a killer who took down a global icon? Before we dive deeper, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. If you're fascinated by criminal investigations, behind-the-scenes FBI stories, and high-profile cases that rock the world, you'll want to stay with us. Subscribe and hit that notification bell because I'm about to tell you secrets, insights, and chilling details that only someone with first-hand experience can share. We're just getting started, and trust me, you don't want to miss what comes next. Now let's take a closer look at the case that not only changed the music world forever, but also pushed the FBI into action. Let's go back to that fateful night in December. As an FBI agent involved in the investigation, I vividly remember how the city of New York and the entire world seemed to stop. The streets were flooded with news crews, thousands of fans gathered outside the Dakota building where Lennon lived, mourning the loss of their hero. It was a chaotic time, and the FBI was tasked with a monumental responsibility: to unravel the mystery of why someone would shoot a man like Lennon. But what we didn't expect was the trail of questions and complexities we would encounter as we tried to piece together the horrifying puzzle. Stay with me as I walk you through the investigation, the clues that led us to uncover the mind of the killer who took down a global icon. Keep watching, because the details you're about to hear will not only shock you, they will change the way you look at one of the most famous murder investigations in history.
As the news of John Lennon's death spread like wildfire, the crime scene at the Dakota building became the focal point of an intense investigation. I vividly remember stepping onto the scene just hours after the shots rang out. It was cold, the streets illuminated by the glow of police lights, and there was a somber quiet that felt almost unnatural. The scene itself, though chaotic, told a story, one that would eventually reveal just how carefully orchestrated the murder of Lennon truly was. Lennon was shot outside his apartment just moments after he returned from a recording session with his wife, Yoko Ono. The assailant, Mark David Chapman, was sitting on the steps outside the building, quietly waiting for Lennon to arrive. It's important to understand the mindset of Chapman at that moment. He wasn't acting impulsively. This was a man who had spent weeks planning, obsessing over his target, and his obsession only grew stronger as the days passed. As I arrived at the scene, I could see the shock on the faces of the officers who were securing the area. It wasn't just the murder of a rock star. It was the loss of a global figure, and the city was in turmoil. I stepped past the yellow police tape and into the dimly lit entrance of the Dakota. There, just outside the door, lay the traces of an unimaginable tragedy. The first thing that struck me was the silence. No screams, no outbursts, only the faint hum of the city around us. The police had already begun collecting evidence, but the crime scene was still fresh. Lennon had been shot 4 times in total, with 2 shots striking him in the back and 2 more piercing his shoulder and chest. The bullets had torn through his body with a brutal force, leaving a trail of blood that stained the sidewalk. His body was lying there, motionless, while the world outside waited for answers. As investigators, we quickly began to gather every piece of evidence we could. We found Chapman sitting on the sidewalk, just feet away from where Lennon fell. He was eerily calm, almost tranquil, his mind already fixated on something else entirely. We knew he was the one who pulled the trigger, but what we didn't know yet was why. Why Lennon? Why that night? We combed through his personal belongings and found a copy of The Catcher in the Rye, a book that Chapman had carried with him for days. He claimed that the book was his inspiration for the murder, citing its main character, Holden Caulfield, as someone who shared his disillusionment with the world. It was a disturbing glimpse into his psyche, but it didn't explain everything. Chapman was more than just a fan, he was obsessed. The police quickly moved to arrest Chapman, but even with him in custody, the mystery of his motivations lingered. Why would someone so obsessed with a man they had never met take such drastic action? Was there more to the story? Was Lennon's fame the true reason for his death? Or was there something deeper at play? I remember the difficulty of processing the magnitude of the situation. We were dealing with the murder of a legend, but we also had to remember our duty to find answers. Chapman's confession was chilling, but it didn't provide the closure we needed. The investigation would continue for weeks as we dug deeper into Chapman's history, his mental health, and any potential connections that could explain this tragic act. What we uncovered was far from simple. It was a complicated web of delusions, obsessions, and brokenness that had led to one of the most shocking acts of violence the world had ever seen.
As the investigation into John Lennon's murder unfolded, I found myself diving deep into the psyche of the man who had taken his life, Mark David Chapman. This wasn't just another criminal case. It was a battle to understand a killer's obsession with his victim. And, more importantly, it was about uncovering how the FBI could piece together the motivations behind such a senseless crime. Chapman was unlike most murderers we investigated. There was no clear motive rooted in financial gain, no personal vendetta, and no escape from the law that he was desperately seeking. Instead, we were left with a disturbing sense of calm from the killer himself. He was arrested at the scene, sitting on the sidewalk, nonchalantly reading The Catcher in the Rye as if nothing had happened. This odd behavior raised immediate questions. Why would a man who had just murdered a global icon act as if he had done something trivial? Our first move was to interrogate him, and what we learned in those hours after his arrest would give us the first clues as to why Lennon was targeted. Chapman had an obsession with Lennon that had begun long before the fateful night in December 1980. It wasn't just that Lennon was famous. It was Lennon's own words, his image, and what Chapman perceived as the hypocrisy of his life that had drawn him in. Chapman believed Lennon had claimed to be a Christian, but had embraced a lifestyle that he felt contradicted that label. The more Chapman read about Lennon, the more he grew disgusted by what he saw as hypocrisy. But what really puzzled us was that Chapman didn't hate Lennon. In fact, he admired him in a twisted way. He saw Lennon as a symbol of something greater, of all the things that were wrong with the world. Chapman's mental state became the center of our investigation. We knew that understanding his mental illness was crucial to understanding his crime. Chapman's history showed signs of long-term psychological issues. He had been in and out of psychiatric hospitals, had a history of depression, and had struggled with his identity for years. He was a man caught between his fantasy world and reality, and when Lennon's image was tarnished in his eyes, it pushed him over the edge. Through a series of interviews, we uncovered Chapman's growing obsession. He began to see himself as someone with a mission, someone who had to take down the phony Lennon for the greater good. We also discovered Chapman's fixation on celebrity culture. He wanted to be famous, and he believed that by killing someone as influential as Lennon, he could achieve the fame and notoriety he so desperately craved. But there was something else beneath it all. Chapman had a deep, almost religious obsession with The Catcher in the Rye, and it became clear that he saw himself as part of the narrative in the book. He identified with Holden Caulfield, the novel's disillusioned protagonist, and thought killing Lennon would make him part of the book's story. His delusions were growing stronger, and he felt this murder would make him famous, his name etched into history like the tragic hero in the book. For us, the investigation became more than just solving a murder. It became about understanding the mind of someone whose grip on reality was slipping away. We spent countless hours poring over his history, his past mental health evaluations, and his connections to various influences. Chapman's case was unique, but it was also a sobering reminder of how dangerous a person could be when they were consumed by obsession, mental illness, and delusion. Understanding the mind of a killer is never easy, but in this case it was crucial. What we learned would help us understand just how someone could go from being a fan of John Lennon to becoming the man who killed him.
As the days passed following John Lennon's tragic death, the scale of the investigation became clear. What started as a local New York Police Department case quickly escalated into a national and international matter, with the FBI playing a pivotal role. The murder of such a high-profile figure as Lennon required coordination across multiple law enforcement agencies, and our involvement became indispensable. The collaboration between the FBI and the NYPD was a delicate balance of resources, expertise, and shared determination. From the moment Mark David Chapman was arrested, we knew that the investigation would be far from straightforward. While Chapman had confessed to the crime, we needed to ensure that every aspect of his motive was understood. Every clue was followed, and every lead was exhausted. This wasn't just about solving the murder. It was about understanding how and why someone could commit such a senseless act. One of the early challenges we faced was the overwhelming public attention. Lennon's death wasn't just a tragedy for his family and his fans. It was a global event. This posed significant challenges for investigators. With so much media scrutiny, there was a constant pressure to find the right answers, and we had to be cautious not to let public opinion or sensationalism interfere with the investigation. We had to remain impartial, focusing on the facts, and work closely with the NYPD to build a strong case against Chapman. NYPD detectives took the lead in gathering physical evidence from the crime scene, while the FBI focused on understanding Chapman's background and motivations. We spent hours reviewing his past, including his psychiatric evaluations, his mental health history, and the obsessions that had clearly played a major role in his crime. As we delved deeper into his psyche, we realized just how deluded Chapman had become. Meanwhile, the NYPD's forensics team combed through Chapman's belongings, hoping to uncover additional clues that could explain the events leading up to the murder. One of the most unsettling pieces of evidence they found was a letter that Chapman had written to himself days before the murder, expressing his belief that he was destined for fame by killing Lennon. The chilling tone of the letter underscored the extent of Chapman's obsession, but it also revealed something we hadn't considered. This wasn't just about Lennon. It was about Chapman's own desperation to escape the emptiness he felt in his life, to become someone important. The collaboration between the FBI and NYPD also involved careful surveillance of Chapman's movements leading up to the murder. We examined his time spent in New York, his actions around the Dakota building, and his interactions with those who knew him. While we had Chapman in custody, we still needed to understand the full context of his actions. By working alongside the NYPD's detectives, we pieced together his behavior leading up to the murder, and it became evident that Chapman was planning this act for weeks. He had become fixated on Lennon, almost as if the world was closing in on him, and the only way to escape the chaos was through violence. We also focused on understanding how Chapman's obsession with the catcher in the rye played a role in his actions. The book had become almost a sacred text to him, and he truly believed that killing Lennon would make him the protagonist of his own twisted narrative.
It was as if he thought he could rewrite his own life by making a mark on the world in the most extreme way possible. We knew we had to understand his delusion in full in order to grasp the reasoning behind such an act. The investigation was not just about collecting evidence. It was about dealing with the complexity of a case where the perpetrator's mental state was in question. We worked day and night, collaborating with the NYPD to piece together the puzzle and to ensure that Mark David Chapman's actions didn't remain a mystery. It was one of the most complex cases I had ever worked on, but it was also a testament to the power of collaboration in the pursuit of justice.
The murder of John Lennon was an event that shook not only New York City, but the entire world. It was impossible to predict the level of public reaction that would follow. As an FBI agent involved in the investigation, I found myself confronting not only the intricacies of the case, but also the overwhelming emotional response from the public. Lennon wasn't just a musician. He was a symbol of peace, love, and activism. His death left a massive void, and the anger, grief, and confusion were palpable in every corner of the globe. In the immediate aftermath of the murder, the FBI's role expanded beyond the investigation itself. We were tasked with helping to manage the public's reaction, preventing chaos, and ensuring that the case didn't become more about sensationalism than justice. The world was grieving, and as law enforcement, we had to act quickly to prevent the case from becoming more about sensationalism than justice. One of the first challenges we faced was the media storm. News outlets, both local and international, were fixated on every detail of the murder, and speculation ran rampant. Was the murder politically motivated? Was it connected to Lennon's outspoken activism? Was there a larger conspiracy? These were just a few of the questions circulating in the days following the murder. As the FBI, we had to keep the facts straight, prevent misinformation, and ensure that the investigation remained focused on Mark David Chapman, not wild theories. Another significant challenge was dealing with the outpouring of grief from fans and citizens. Public memorials were held across the world, and spontaneous gatherings took place outside the Dakota building where Lennon had been shot. People wanted answers, and while we were working around the clock to understand the motivations behind Chapman's crime, there was very little that could immediately satisfy the public's need for closure. We also had to deal with the emotional toll on those closest to Lennon. His wife, Yoko Ono, was devastated, and the investigation quickly became personal for many of us. We weren't just working on solving a case. We were working to provide justice for a man who had inspired so many people and whose death had left an indelible mark on the world. The FBI had to navigate the intersection of law enforcement and the deep emotions of the people we were sworn to protect. One thing that became clear as we dug deeper into Chapman's background was that his obsession with Lennon was not just about the music. It was about the image of Lennon that Chapman had created in his mind. Lennon, in Chapman's view, had become a symbol of everything wrong with the world, and Chapman's desire to destroy that symbol was central to his delusion. This was something we had to manage carefully. The emotional reaction to Lennon's death was so intense that any hint of a larger conspiracy could have further fueled the public's anger and confusion. As we began to piece together the details of Chapman's life and his obsession with the Catcher in the Rye, it became clear that he had been living in his own delusional reality. To us, it was an example of how dangerous untreated mental illness could become when combined with a fragile ego and an unrelenting desire for fame. Chapman had killed Lennon in a bid to become someone, to etch his name into history as a part of the same narrative he believed he was living in. But it wasn't just about solving the crime. We had to do more. We had to prevent any more media-driven hysteria, keep conspiracies in check, and ensure the case remained focused on the facts. We were the ones who had to stand firm, focus on the investigation, and make sure the truth got out. As frustrating as it was at times, this was part of our duty, and it was the duty of the FBI to bring justice to the man who had taken Lennon's life. Through everything, the grief, the media frenzy, and the challenges of understanding Chapman's twisted motivations, we knew one thing: justice had to be served.
Mark David Chapman may have thought he would become a hero in his own story, but in the end, he was just another troubled soul who took a great man's life. We, as investigators, were determined to make sure that Lennon's legacy remained untarnished and that Chapman was held accountable for his actions.
As we continued to investigate John Lennon's murder, it became clear that Mark David Chapman wasn't just another troubled person committing a senseless act. There was something deeply disturbing about him, something that went beyond the typical profile of a killer. Chapman had a chilling obsession with Lennon, and our job was to understand the motivations behind this madness. We had to get into his mind and figure out what drove him to kill such an icon. Chapman's background was far from ordinary. Born in 1955 in Fort Worth, Texas, he had a troubled childhood marked by isolation and emotional neglect. As a teenager, Chapman began to struggle with mental health issues, and his life was filled with episodes of depression and despair. He had attempted suicide multiple times, and at one point he had been hospitalized for psychiatric care. But what was most striking about Chapman was his obsession with fame and recognition. He wanted to be noticed, to have his name etched into the history books, and he saw Lennon as the key to achieving this twisted ambition. In our investigation, we discovered that Chapman had been fixated on The Catcher in the Rye, J.D. Salinger's famous novel. He identified with the protagonist, Holden Caulfield, feeling that he was an outsider in society, just as Holden was. Chapman saw Lennon as the ultimate phony, much like Holden viewed the adult world, and he believed that by killing Lennon, he would make a statement. He would remove the phony and replace it with something real, something that would make him famous. In Chapman's distorted mind, this act would propel him into the spotlight. We interviewed those who knew Chapman, hoping to find clues that might explain his escalating obsession. His ex-wife, Gloria, was one of the first to shed light on his state of mind. She described Chapman as a man who struggled to connect with reality, someone who had difficulty distinguishing between fantasy and the real world. Chapman had spent months in New York City before the murder, and he had even visited the Dakota building where Lennon lived multiple times before the killing. We also learned that Chapman had been obsessed with the idea of killing Lennon for weeks, even bringing The Catcher in the Rye with him on the day of the murder, almost as if he were preparing to fulfill his destiny. What was particularly disturbing was that Chapman's delusion was entirely self-absorbed. He didn't view himself as a murderer. He saw himself as a hero. He genuinely believed that by killing Lennon, he would make the world a better place, or at least draw attention to his existence. His desire to escape the void of insignificance led him to believe that the ultimate way to gain notoriety was through violence. The more we uncovered about his thoughts and actions, the clearer it became that this wasn't a random act of violence. This was a premeditated execution based on warped ideology. Chapman had been planning this for a long time. He had studied Lennon's movements, his routine, and the places he frequented. He had taken the time to learn about Lennon's activism, his beliefs, and his public persona. To Chapman, Lennon represented everything he despised, the phony celebrity culture, the world of people who seemed to have everything, while he struggled with his own deep dissatisfaction. And that dissatisfaction, that bitterness, is what drove him to do the unthinkable. But the most unsettling part of our investigation came after Chapman's arrest. When we spoke to him, his demeanor was disturbingly calm. He didn't seem remorseful. In fact, he appeared more like a man who had completed an important task. He described the murder with cold precision, almost as if it were a business transaction or a job well done. It was clear that Chapman didn't view Lennon's death as a tragedy, but rather as the culmination of his twisted quest for fame. As we delved deeper into his psyche, we also discovered a man who had been hiding in plain sight. He had visited numerous places before the murder, making odd statements to those around him, all while hiding his true intentions. He didn't act like a typical killer. He was an enigma. And as we pieced together the final moments before Lennon's death, it became evident that Chapman was a man driven by deep, unresolved psychological issues, exacerbated by an overwhelming desire to be noticed.
Understanding Mark David Chapman's motivations was one of the most chilling aspects of the investigation. It wasn't just about solving a crime. It was about trying to understand the mind of someone who had committed murder for reasons that defied logic. And in doing so, we were forced to confront the terrifying reality of how far obsession can drive a person when they are disconnected from reality. Chapman's delusions and actions were not just the result of a fleeting impulse, they were the outcome of years of isolation, mental illness, and distorted thinking. His desire for fame and validation was so overpowering that it led him to take the life of one of the most famous men in the world. And it was up to us, as investigators, to piece together the clues and understand the mind of a killer who believed that taking a life would make him important.
As we continued to investigate John Lennon's murder, it became increasingly apparent that the case wasn't going to be as straightforward as we had hoped. At first, the evidence seemed clear. Mark David Chapman had been the one to pull the trigger. But as we delved deeper into his past and his actions, we began to realize that there was more to this story than just a simple case of a deranged fan taking the life of a beloved celebrity. Our first challenge was understanding the motive. Chapman's own confession was chilling, but as seasoned agents, we knew better than to take a confession at face value. In order to truly understand why Chapman had killed Lennon, we needed to explore every angle and piece of evidence, no matter how uncomfortable or unsettling it might be. One of the key aspects of the investigation was tracking Chapman's movements in the days leading up to the murder. We discovered that Chapman had been in New York for several weeks before the shooting. He had visited the Dakota, where Lennon lived, multiple times, lurking in the area, scoping out the place. He had also made trips to various parts of the city, acting strangely and showing signs of distress. It was clear that this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment crime. Chapman had planned it meticulously. But what stood out in our investigation was Chapman's relationship with his own reality. He had a complex psychological profile that made it difficult to pinpoint his true intentions. On one hand, he was a man who had idolized Lennon to the point of obsession, but on the other, he believed that by killing him, he would somehow gain a place in history, akin to a twisted kind of hero. His obsession with The Catcher in the Rye was a crucial part of this mindset, and it gave us some insight into how he had rationalized his actions. Our team spent countless hours reviewing Chapman's history, speaking with those who had known him, and piecing together his life leading up to the murder. We discovered that Chapman had a history of mental health issues, including multiple suicide attempts and periods of hospitalization. These troubled years were marked by isolation, loneliness, and an overwhelming sense of not being seen by the world. Chapman had been living in his own disconnected reality for years, and Lennon had become a symbol of everything Chapman loathed: fame, success, and the phony nature of the celebrity world. As we examined the murder itself, we learned that Chapman had waited for hours outside the Dakota building before finally seeing Lennon. The moment when Lennon approached him, looking calm and unsuspecting, was an eerie scene. Chapman claimed that Lennon had even smiled at him, though it's unclear whether Lennon was aware of the danger at that moment, or whether Chapman was simply adding a layer of delusion to the event. The real breakthrough came when we interviewed those who had encountered Chapman in the days before the murder. He had been acting erratically, telling people he was going to do something important. His erratic behavior and his statements only reinforced the idea that Chapman was mentally unstable and completely disconnected from reality. But it was still hard to understand how someone could spiral so far into madness that they would take the life of another person, someone they had never met, simply to become famous. We also interviewed experts who had treated Chapman in the past. Many pointed to the fact that Chapman had been diagnosed with severe mental health disorders, including depression and possible personality disorders. But what made this case even more complex was the fact that Chapman's delusions seemed to be rooted in his own warped sense of justice. He had seen himself as a savior of sorts, ridding the world of what he believed to be a phony figure. He wasn't simply a murderer. He was someone who had twisted his mind to the point where he believed his actions were justified.
As the investigation progressed, it became clear that Chapman wasn't just a fan who snapped. He was someone who had been living in a world of delusion for years. His obsession with Lennon, combined with his mental health struggles, led him to view the murder not as an act of violence, but as a way to immortalize himself in history. It was chilling to think that someone could commit such a horrific act with the belief that they were somehow making the world a better place. Throughout the investigation, we had to constantly remind ourselves of the emotional toll that this case was taking on everyone involved. John Lennon was an icon, someone who had impacted millions of lives. To think that someone could erase such a presence with a single act of violence was incomprehensible. Yet, the reality was that Chapman had done just that. We continued to gather evidence, piece by piece, trying to understand how this tragedy could have unfolded. But even with all the evidence, the question of why remained hauntingly elusive. Chapman's motives were unclear, his mental state questionable, and his actions terrifyingly deliberate. The investigation into John Lennon's murder was far from over. Even after the arrest, there were so many unanswered questions about what truly motivated Mark David Chapman to commit such a senseless crime. What we did know for sure, however, was that the murder of John Lennon had forever changed the world, and our investigation into the mind of the killer would continue to haunt us for years to come.
As the investigation into John Lennon's murder continued, the world was left in shock. No one could have predicted that such an icon, someone whose music had transcended generations, would be taken in such a brutal and senseless act. The FBI had its hands full, not only in determining the motivation behind the crime, but also in dealing with the overwhelming media attention and public reaction. The death of John Lennon was not just a tragedy for his family and friends, it was a global tragedy that left millions grieving. The world had lost the figure who had helped shape the cultural landscape of the 20th century. The immediate aftermath of Lennon's death was chaotic. Thousands gathered in Central Park in New York City, mourning the loss of their hero. Fans, young and old, wept openly, some even holding vigils outside the Dakota, the building where Lennon had been murdered. The sense of disbelief was palpable. How could something so terrible happen to someone who had brought so much joy and inspiration to the world? It was as if the world had stopped for a moment, caught in a collective grief. For the FBI, the investigation had only just begun. While Chapman had already confessed to the crime, there were still so many unanswered questions about why he had done it and whether there were any larger forces at play. The media, too, began to speculate on the motivations behind the murder, with various theories surfacing. Some pointed to Chapman's obsession with The Catcher in the Rye and his belief that Lennon was a phony. Others speculated that it was an act of revenge or a desire for fame. But no matter the theories, the tragic fact remained. John Lennon, a man who had stood for peace and love, was gone. The media frenzy around the case was immense. Every new detail was picked apart, analyzed, and sensationalized by news outlets. The public was hungry for answers, but the FBI knew that rushing to conclusions could be just as dangerous as the crime itself. The truth needed to come to light through careful investigation and analysis. As investigators, we understood that while the emotional impact of the crime was undeniable, we had to maintain objectivity and focus on the facts. One of the most difficult aspects of the aftermath was the overwhelming pressure from the media and public. The case had become a spectacle, with cameras and reporters following every move of the investigators. Public opinion swirled with rumors, speculation, and conspiracy theories. Some even questioned the official narrative, with some even suggesting that Chapman had been manipulated or that there was a larger conspiracy behind Lennon's death. But as law enforcement, our job was not to give in to the noise. It was to seek the truth and uncover the full scope of what had happened. The psychological toll of this case was immense. We as investigators had to constantly remind ourselves of the emotional weight of the tragedy. This was not just a high-profile case. It was a crime that had shaken the very foundations of popular culture. As much as we were focused on the facts and the investigation, we couldn't ignore the human cost.
The fans who mourned Lennon were not just grieving the loss of a musician, they were grieving the loss of a symbol of peace, love, and hope. As weeks turned into months, the cultural impact of Lennon's death only grew. Memorials to him sprang up around the world, and his music surged in popularity. Imagine, Give Peace a Chance, and Let It Be were played on repeat as people sought solace in the words of the man who had been taken too soon. Lennon's death had, in many ways, immortalized him. The grief surrounding his death had turned into a tribute to his legacy, and his message of peace and unity continued to resonate in the hearts of millions. For the FBI, the work didn't stop once Chapman was arrested. The investigation would continue for months, even years, as we pieced together the complexities of Chapman's psychological profile and his motivations. Every time we uncovered a new detail, we were forced to reckon with the impact it had, not only on the families involved, but on the broader world that had been touched by Lennon's music and message. The investigation would ultimately lead to Chapman's conviction, but the emotional and cultural repercussions of Lennon's death would remain for decades to come. Through it all, one thing was clear. John Lennon's murder was not just a crime, it was a defining moment in history. It was a reminder that even the greatest among us are vulnerable, and that violence, in any form, is a threat to the very ideals of peace and love that Lennon had championed. But in the aftermath of tragedy, we also saw the resilience of the human spirit. The world would continue to mourn, but we would never forget the lessons Lennon taught us. And we as law enforcement would continue to ensure that justice was served, even as the echoes of that fateful night lingered in our minds.
As we continued our investigation into John Lennon's murder, it became clear that this case would resonate far beyond the confines of law enforcement and the courtroom. The world had lost more than just a celebrity. Lennon was an icon, someone whose message of peace, love, and unity had transcended generations. As an FBI agent involved in the investigation, I couldn't ignore the overwhelming emotional impact the case had on people worldwide. It wasn't just about finding the killer. It was about understanding the cultural and societal ripples caused by his untimely death. Despite the fact that Mark David Chapman had confessed to the crime, the question still loomed. Why? Why would someone kill an icon of peace and harmony? What could possibly drive a person to commit such a horrific act? Chapman's motivations were complex, and as the investigation unfolded, we learned that his obsession with Lennon was deeply rooted in a troubled psychological state. But even after his arrest, there was an undeniable sense of confusion surrounding the case. How could someone who admired Lennon so deeply ultimately choose to end his life? The impact of Lennon's death was not just emotional, it was societal. The world had reacted with an outpouring of grief, but the pain extended beyond the fans who mourned his loss. Lennon's influence had been immense. From his music to his political activism, he had shaped the cultural landscape of the 20th century. For many, his death felt like a personal loss, and the aftermath became a rallying cry for justice. For the FBI, our job wasn't done once Chapman was arrested. The investigation continued for months as we delved deeper into his psychological history and examined the circumstances leading to the murder. We had to understand every facet of this case to ensure the truth came to light. But as much as we sought answers, the case became increasingly difficult to navigate, weighed down by the intense media scrutiny and the emotional burden it placed on everyone involved. Every piece of evidence, every interview, and every psychological evaluation revealed new complexities that only added to the mystery of Chapman's actions. One of the most important aspects of the investigation was understanding how Lennon's death had shaped the public's perception of violence. The world was outraged, but it also came to terms with a sobering reality. Violence can strike anywhere, even in the most peaceful of environments. This realization made the case even more profound. It wasn't just the loss of a musical legend. It was a reminder that violence doesn't discriminate. Lennon had advocated for peace throughout his life, but in the end it was violence that took him away. As the investigation progressed, we continued to analyze Chapman's behavior and motives. We learned that he had a deep-seated need for attention and recognition, which ultimately drove him to take such a drastic and tragic action. But the question that still lingered was whether Lennon's death was a result of a larger conspiracy, or if it was, as Chapman claimed, a simple act driven by his obsession with the Catcher in the Rye and his belief that Lennon was a phony. The FBI's role in this case was not just about solving the murder. It was about preserving the integrity of the justice system in the face of overwhelming media pressure. The world was watching, and every move we made was scrutinized. Despite the challenges, the investigation continued with the ultimate goal of bringing closure to a case that had gripped the world's attention. The public demanded answers, and we were determined to deliver them. Lennon's legacy, however, was more than just his music. His death led to greater awareness of the mental health issues that can drive people to commit violent acts, and it sparked important conversations about celebrity culture, obsession, and the societal pressures that affect people in ways we often don't see. In the end, John Lennon's murder was not just a crime. It was a pivotal moment in history. His death highlighted the fragility of life and the unpredictable nature of violence. It also served as a reminder that no matter how famous or beloved someone is, no one is truly safe from the forces that drive others to harm. And while the FBI's investigation brought justice to Lennon's family, it could never undo the damage caused by his death. The world would never be the same, and neither would the generations of fans who had been touched by Lennon's music and message. As an FBI agent who worked on this case, the sense of loss was something we carried with us for a long time. It was a loss that extended far beyond the immediate aftermath of the murder. It was a loss that shaped our understanding of the world, of the people we protect, and of the darkness that can lurk even in the most unexpected places. And as much as we tried to bring justice, we could never erase the pain and the questions that would forever haunt the legacy of John Lennon.